When a starving pregnant wolf stumbled into Keanu Reeves's tent, it became the beginning of an extraordinary bond. But 14 months later, as he returned to the remote lodge where it all began, nothing could have prepared him for what was waiting in the shadows of the forest. "Hey girl, I brought you something special today," Keanu called out softly, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. The familiar silhouette of the pregnant wolf emerged from between the trees, her cautious steps now more confident than 2 weeks ago when they first met. The meat he held would be her salvation, but neither knew then how this encounter would transform both their lives. His heart raced with anticipation as he watched her approach. The wolf's belly had grown noticeably larger since their first encounter, and her golden eyes, once filled with desperate starvation, now held a glimmer of recognition. He carefully placed the fresh meat on the ground, taking a few steps back to give her space. A dance they had perfected over the past fortnight. Standing there in the clearing, Keanu reflected on how far they'd come from that first terrifying encounter in the tent. The wolf's transformation, from a desperate, aggressive intruder to this cautious but trusting creature, was nothing short of remarkable. Every day, she seemed to wait for him, her timing becoming as predictable as his visits. Today, like most days, Matthew and Stephen waited nervously at the forest's edge, their initial terror of the hungry beast, as they dubbed her, still fresh in their minds. They thought Keanu was crazy for continuing these visits, but they couldn't deny the extraordinary bond forming between the actor and the wild creature. The story of their unlikely friendship began during what should have been a routine film shoot, when Mother Nature unleashed her fury on their forest location. 3 weeks of relentless snow had turned their shooting schedule into chaos, forcing Keanu and his colleagues, Matthew and Stephen, to adapt to life in makeshift tents among the towering pines. That fateful morning, while the forest was still shrouded in pre-dawn mist, Matthew's terrified whispers sliced through the silence. "Keanu, don't move." The tremor in his voice made Keanu's eyes snap open. There, silhouetted against their tent's thin fabric by the dying campfire outside, was the unmistakable shape of a wolf. The creature had somehow managed to slip through their carelessly left open tent flap, likely drawn by the lingering scent of their evening meal. The wolf's sharp ears twitched at their movement, and suddenly, the spacious tent felt like a claustrophobic trap. Matthew and Stephen pressed themselves against the far side, their breathing shallow and quick. But Keanu remained still, his trained actor's eye catching details others might miss. The wolf's movements weren't those of a confident predator. They were desperate, almost clumsy. Her swollen belly told a story of its own. "She's pregnant," Keanu whispered, more to himself than his terrified companions. Acting purely on instinct, he slowly reached for his leftover steak from last night's dinner. The wolf's nose twitched, her attention immediately drawn to the meat. With a gentle underhand motion, Keanu tossed the steak toward her. The wolf's initial aggression dissolved instantly as she snatched up the offering, devouring it with an intensity that spoke of long-term hunger. Matthew and Stephen watched in disbelief as their potential attacker transformed into something almost pitiful before their eyes. What happened next surprised all three of them. After finishing the meat, instead of fleeing, the wolf took a tentative step toward Keanu. Her posture had changed, the aggressive stance replaced by something almost curious. Against his colleagues' urgent whispers of protest, Keanu slowly extended his hand. "You're out of your mind," Stephen hissed, but fell silent as they witnessed something remarkable. The wolf approached Keanu's outstretched hand, sniffed it cautiously, and then, in a moment that seemed to stop time, allowed him to gently touch her head. The connection was electric, profound, and completely unexpected. When she finally left the tent, it wasn't with the fearful retreat of a wild animal, but with measured steps and backward glances that seemed to say, "Until we meet again." The entire encounter had lasted perhaps 15 minutes, but Keanu knew his life had somehow shifted on its axis. Later that day, while the crew worked to salvage what they could of the shooting schedule, Stephen made some disturbing discoveries in town. The local wildlife officer painted a grim picture. Climate change and human expansion had driven bears into wolf territories, forcing the wolves to venture dangerously close to human settlements. Many hadn't survived the transition. The pregnant wolf they'd encountered was likely one of the few survivors of her pack, driven by desperation to seek food wherever she could find it. For Keanu, who had always felt a deep connection to animals, the decision crystallized in that moment. He couldn't simply walk away and leave this creature to face such odds alone. Not when she was carrying new life, and certainly not after the trust she had shown him. After that first full week, the weather showed no signs of mercy. The relentless rain had transformed into an early winter storm, making their tent accommodations increasingly precarious. Keanu, still haunted by the wolf's trusting eyes and aware of her vulnerable condition, knew they needed a more permanent solution, both for the film crew's sake and for his newfound mission. "We can't keep shooting in these conditions anyway," he reasoned with the production manager, who was already calculating the mounting costs of weather delays. "Maybe we should consider relocating to something more substantial." Through the local connections of their guide, Keanu discovered a spacious cedar lodge nestled at the forest's edge, just 2 miles from their original location. The property was perfect, secluded enough to offer privacy from prying eyes, yet accessible enough for the film crew. Most importantly, it bordered the same stretch of woodland where their wolf visitor had emerged. The transition happened quickly. Within 48 hours, their soggy tent city had been dismantled, and the crew settled into the warm comfort of the lodge. But it was the property's unique features that truly convinced Keanu they had made the right choice. The sprawling back deck offered an unobstructed view of the forest, and a natural clearing nearby provided an ideal spot for what he was quietly planning. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" Matthew observed one evening, watching Keanu construct a sheltered feeding station in the clearing. The structure was thoughtfully designed, protected from the elements but open enough not to feel like a trap to a wild animal. "She trusted us, Matthew," Keanu replied, securing the last support beam. "In her most vulnerable moment, she chose to trust humans. I can't ignore that." His dedication soon paid off. On the third night in their new location, motion-sensitive lights captured her reddish form emerging from the tree line. The wolf, still cautious but somehow more confident, approached the feeding station. From the deck's vantage point, Keanu could see her condition more clearly now. Her pregnancy was progressing, but she looked bony. The crew, initially skeptical of Keanu's wolf project, began to share his investment in their unusual neighbor's welfare. Even Stephen, who had been the most vocal about the risks, was often the first to check the motion sensor footage each morning. As October drew to a close, they established a routine that seemed to work for everyone. The wolf would visit in the early morning hours, just before dawn, and again at dusk. Keanu made sure to be on the deck during these times, maintaining a respectful distance while gradually becoming a familiar presence in her world. Sometimes she would pause after eating, her golden eyes meeting his across the clearing. In those moments, the boundary between wild and tame seemed to blur just a little more. As November's chill settled over the lodge, reality began to intrude on their woodland idyll. The call came on a particularly frosty morning. Keanu's agent, a apologetic but insistent, informed him of an unmovable obligation. A major studio had fast-tracked a project he had committed to months ago, long before a pregnant wolf had wandered into his life and changed everything. 3 days, his agent said firmly. That's all the time we can buy you before you need to be on set in New Zealand. The news hit Keanu like a physical blow. He had been hoping to stay at least until the wolf delivered her pups. The local veterinarian estimated she had about 2 weeks left. Standing on the deck that evening, watching her familiar form emerge from the tree line, the weight of his impending departure felt almost unbearable. Maria, the lodge's longtime housekeeper, found him there long after sunset, still staring into the darkness. "Mr. Reeves," she said softly, "we will feed and take care of her. I promise you." Her words were backed by decades of quiet reliability, and Keanu knew that she meant every word. Over the next 2 days, he meticulously organized everything. Detailed feeding schedules, emergency veterinary contacts, and enough funds to ensure the wolf and her future pups would want for nothing. His last morning at the lodge dawned clear and cold. The wolf appeared as usual, but something was different. Whether she sensed the change in routine or simply picked up on Keanu's emotional state, she lingered longer than usual. Instead of retreating after her meal, she sat on the edge of the clearing, her golden eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his throat tighten. "I'll come back," he whispered, knowing she couldn't understand the words, but hoping somehow she'd sense their meaning. The months that followed were filled with a strange mixture of professional triumph and personal longing. Maria kept her word, sending regular updates about their wild friend. The most momentous came in late December. The wolf had delivered 6 healthy pups. The news brought tears to Keanu's eyes in the middle of a production meeting, earning him curious looks from his colleagues. But it was the reports of the wolf's behavior that truly tugged at his heart. Maria described how she would appear at their usual meeting spot, even though the feeding station had been moved closer to her den for convenience. On quiet nights, her haunting howls would echo across the valley, reaching the lodge in mournful waves that made even the skeptical groundskeeper, Old Joe, shake his head in wonder. "She's calling for you," Maria wrote in one of her messages. "We all know it." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was actually 14 months, Keanu found himself driving the familiar road back to the lodge. The landscape had changed. Nature never stays still. But something deeper remained unchanged. The air still carried the same crisp pine scent, and the mountains still stood sentinel against the sky. As he pulled up to the lodge, his heart pounded with equal parts excitement and anxiety. Would she remember him? Would she still be here? Had she grown truly wild again in his absence? The pups would be nearly grown now. Would they see him as a threat? Maria met him at the door, her weathered face breaking into a warm smile. "You've missed so much," she said, leading him inside, "but there's something you need to see first." She guided him to the back deck, now bathed in the golden light of sunset. As they stood there, Maria pressed a pair of binoculars into his hands and pointed toward the tree line. "Watch," she whispered. "They always come at this time." The minutes stretched like hours as Keanu scanned the forest's edge. Then, just as the sun dipped behind the mountains, movement caught his eye. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the focus. Keanu could make out a familiar golden fur catching the last rays of sunlight. She looked stronger now, leaner but healthier. And behind her, his breath caught. 6 nearly grown wolves moved with the fluid grace of their mother. Then, something unbelievable happened. The wind shifted slightly, carrying his scent down to the clearing. The wolf's head snapped up, her nose testing the air. Then, without warning, she let out a howl so powerful it seemed to shake the very foundation of the lodge. It wasn't her usual evening call. This was different, filled with raw emotion that made the hair on the back of Keanu's neck stand up. "Go," Maria whispered urgently, pushing him toward the stairs. "Go to her." Keanu didn't need to be told twice. He took the deck stairs 2 at a time, his heart thundering in his chest. The wolf was already running toward him, covering the distance between them with powerful strides that defied every wild instinct she could have possessed. Her pups hung back at the forest's edge, watching with alert curiosity as their mother raced toward the human. They met in the middle of the clearing, where so many of their dawn and dusk encounters had taken place. The wolf slowed just before reaching him, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then, she pressed her head against his outstretched hand, just as she had that first morning in the tent. Keanu felt tears spring to his eyes. "I missed you too, girl," he whispered, dropping to his knees. She moved closer, allowing him to wrap his arms around her neck in an embrace that bridged the gap between wild and tame. Her fur was thick and warm, smelling of pine needles and freedom. A series of yips drew their attention. The pups, emboldened by their mother's trust, had crept closer. They were beautiful, some carrying their mother's golden coat, others darker, all moving with the same fluid grace. One by one they approached, their initial wariness giving way to curiosity as they sniffed at the human who had helped ensure their survival. But the reunion was destined to be brief. A distant howl echoed across the valley, and the wolf's ears pricked up. Keanu saw them then, silhouetted against the darkening sky on the ridge above the clearing. A pack of wolves, strong, wild, and free. They were waiting for her. The wolf stepped back from Keanu's embrace, her golden eyes meeting his one last time. There was something different in them now, not just trust or friendship, but a quiet confidence. She had found her place in the world again, had raised her pups to strength, and now it was time for her to return to where she truly belonged. She turned toward her pack but paused after a few steps, looking back over her shoulder. She let out one more howl, softer this time, almost like a whisper. Then, she gathered her pups with a quick motion of her head and began moving toward the ridge. Keanu watched them go, his heart both full and aching. The pups loped ahead, eager to join their new family, but their mother's pace was unhurried. 3 times, she stopped and looked back, each pause a silent goodbye. At the top of the ridge, she halted one final time, her form stark against the purple sky. For a moment, she stood perfectly still, as if committing the scene to memory. Then, with a flick of her tail, she disappeared over the crest, leaving only the wind and the gathering darkness behind. Maria appeared at his side, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "She needed you then," she said softly. "But she needed to be free more." Keanu nodded, unable to speak. He understood that what had happened here was something rare and precious. A moment when the walls between human and wild had briefly dissolved, allowing something extraordinary to flourish. The wolf had given him far more than he had given her. A reminder that sometimes the purest connections are the ones we have to let go. As night settled over the valley, a chorus of howls drifted down from the distant hills, the voice of his wolf, now joined with many others, strong, wild, and free, exactly as it should be. What a beautiful bond. Would you help a starving wild animal? Or would you be too scared of the consequences? Do you think Keanu did the right thing? Tell us in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.